Hello, and thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program, How to Ensure Your Employees Are Engaged in a Hybrid Workplace. My name is Melanie Turek. I'm a Senior Fellow and Vice President of Consulting with Frost Sullivan, and I will be your moderator today. Joining me to discuss this topic is Dev Das, Vice President of Customer Experience and Operations at Globalization Partners. So how do we make sure that once we've hired the right people, we've brought them in, we've got them set up and ready to go, that they stay engaged in the context of a global hybrid workplace?
Yeah, I think engagement is so important because when you think about an employee, perhaps completely remote, right? The stickiness to the employer is in some ways reducing. Like the barrier to switch is different. When you were used to driving to one office location versus now you're switching companies, it's a different location. Maybe it's further away. Like all of those things all weigh on the person's mind when they're thinking about leaving one place or another. Today, you can leave one company, go to another company, and you're still working in your home office, right? So engagement, I think, is so important. The way that we've thought about engagement, similar to what I was talking about in onboarding, but I think even more dramatically important, is it's got to be so culturally appropriate, and it's got to be multimodal, multi-channel, multimedia formats, and it's got to appeal to different sorts of folks, right? Like some team members I found would love to do like a Friday afternoon, kind of lunch and learn on video, right? Some absolutely hate something like that, right? And I think more and more it's getting to a place where what we have done is ask our teams, like, what are the 5 or 6 different engagement formats that different folks like? And we're going to offer them all. Because it really is about figuring out the things that work for different segments. If there's one format that works for many, that's wonderful, right? But my experience has been that that's typically not the case. It's really about offering different sorts of things to be able to engage and motivate. And again, fundamentally realizing that engagement and motivation is very different in a world where folks aren't going to this physical hub location anymore, and more challenging.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned that because it's, so partly it's, well, we are living in this interesting world where a lot of the time we're talking to each other on a screen. And, like you said, some people, hey, I'll do that and eat my sandwich and have a drink and have a good time with you. And some people they don't even want to be on video for a serious meeting. But there's also, I think, the fact that there is a segment of the population for whom moving to home-based work was a godsend, right? They did not really, they're introverts or whatever, and I'm one of them. So I can say, going into an office every day and doing the office thing just wasn't really what they wanted to do. And what, being home has allowed is for them to kind of live their true selves, if you will. And so then if you go back, now we don't have to live that way. And you now require that they go back to that previous way of being at the workplace. That can be really hard, right? Because you're sort of saying you can't be true to who you are anymore. You have to conform to our idea of what it's like to be in a collaborative, cooperative environment. And so I think as we start to see more people working more often in person, we need to really be cognizant of the fact that that still doesn't mean that everybody wants to go and, play bingo on Friday afternoon or whatever it may be, right? And be sensitive to not just the culture, but also individual needs.
Yeah, I agree. I also think as we think about engagement and motivation and sort of hybrid remote, the ability for companies to have people from different locations, therefore different cultures, different backgrounds, that's gone way up. And so the cultural awareness, the norm setting, the bringing diversity and inclusion even more front and center in everyday interactions becomes so important, right? Because there's just much more of this cross-cultural, cross-time zone, cross-team work happening now, even than prior to this move towards the hybrid environment.
And so is that something you think companies should proactively train on? Like if you're working in different geographic regions, different cultural areas, this is what you need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that a number of times, right? I think just what are the norms of working in a remote hybrid environment? How do you think about different cultures working together? What are different styles like, especially for folks that are maybe earlier on in their careers, not having worked with large global teams? There are assumptions like, oh, that person was quiet, therefore they're disengaged. Well, no, that's more of a cultural thing, maybe exacerbated now by the fact that they're on video, right? I think it's those kinds of things are really important. And I think it's okay for a company to superimpose their beliefs on top of sort of the acceptance of cultural norms. So as an example, companies are moving more to an async environment, right? And so the company norm is like, hey, but as you're going into this meeting, you're expected to have read and commented on a document a few times, because then that makes our 1 hour Zoom call or half an hour Zoom call a lot more effective. And I think being more explicit about those sorts of things so we can level set, especially with some cultures that are very thoughtful and more inclined to read, review, and comment beforehand, whereas others are more like, let's just brainstorm and get together, right? So neither one is right or wrong. It's just different. And in places like that, I think a company norm helps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we've seen that I think in the school setting a lot, that sort of flipped classroom idea, but I hadn't really thought about it the way you're describing it in the workplace, but it's true. We're doing more and more of that kind of flipped model where you are expected to kind of do the research and the work before you come to the meeting, right? And be prepared. And, part of that is probably because we all just were in so many meetings, online, that felt really easy to have a meeting, but now we're realizing we can't do that all the time, and we need them to be productive. The other thing I want to ask a little bit about, you mentioned or sort of alluded to this idea of at the very beginning of, if you change jobs, it's no longer the case that feels like a significant environmental change. And one thing that made me think of is the same is true, when we talk about customer service, for example, like how easy churn is these days, because it's a click of a button for me to buy it from one place or another. I have no emotional attachment to the place. To what extent are you seeing that in the workplace, especially for people who joined an organization and never have been physically on site, maybe have never met their colleagues? What do you do to prevent that, right? To make sure that they do feel some kind of actual meaningful connection to the organization so that they don't just jump at the next good opportunity?
Yeah, it's stronger differentiation on the things that matter, right? The physical facilities, the free lunches may or may not be relevant, especially in the remote hybrid environment. But really rethinking what are those critical employee elements, the employee value proposition, that are much more important in a remote hybrid environment. What kind of equipment allowance do you give folks? Do you give folks ability to have an adjustable desk, have a chair? How do you think about internet reimbursement? Like, these sorts of things and many other can create stickiness and differentiation that's much more relevant than what it used to be in a much more physical hub type location environment. We haven't seen that sort of attrition and switching. We've always had pretty strong engagement motivation with our teams. But you're right. I mean, a lot of companies in, let's say, the customer service operations areas, definitely are seeing higher attrition. And that's very expensive. And so actually the business case to create more interesting benefits to keep folks stickier is just a very, very clear ROI.
Yeah. Yeah. And about making those connections as personal as you can, right? And having maybe a few more touch points, just connecting with a person, however they want to be connected with, whether it's through email or on Zoom or on the phone, actually picking up the phone and just having a conversation, whatever works for the people involved, right? But making sure that you keep those connections going, I think, is really important.
Keep the connections going and just being very open to experiment with different sorts of things, and to let the team know, let the employees know that it's okay to try a walking one-on-one. It's okay to have a meeting where your camera off because you're walking your dog. It's okay to try different sorts of things because those are the sorts of ideas and the kinds of innovative experiences that'll make employees stickier in a world where there's less switching cost.
Thanks, Dev. We really appreciate your time and your insights today. And if you'd like to learn more about GP, you can find them on the web at globalization-partners.com. Additional on-demand episodes can also be found at the address on your screen.